My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. In this episode, we speak with Executive Director of the Post-Growth Institute, Donnie Maclurcan. Donnie is also an author and social entrepreneur who is passionate about all things not-for-profit and has helped more than 400 not-for-profit projects start, scale, and sustain themselves.
You're going to find that there's a whole world that's emerging that has been largely hidden and not talked about. And I think it's so exciting to see what doors open up when you can think beyond profit maximization. It really addresses, it comes all the way back to that greatest yearning inside our hearts.
In this episode, we talk about what a not-for-profit, purpose-driven future of economics can look like, and the various actions that we can take to make that future a reality.
For something that is circulatory, where we're caring for each other and connected with each other, and our business models reflect that.
Shifting worldview of economics into a system that can serve both the needs of people and a sustainable planet is something I think we are all ready for. Join us as we discuss what we can do to make that shift possible.
My name's Donnie Maclurcan. I am the Executive Director of the Post-Growth Institute, which is a US-based nonprofit that is helping people connect with an alternative beyond the growth-driven narrative. We conduct research, training, workshops, consulting, and movement-building exercises to really connect the dots for people around what an economy that works looks like, feels like, what it's like to experience, versus the one that we have at the moment, the growth-obsessed economy we live in. I am originally from Australia, born in Sydney, moved to the US in 2013, where I'm an affiliate professor of economics at Southern Oregon University. That's an honorary position, and it's in collaboration with that position that I run this nonprofit institute. My background is pretty broad. I've worked across refugee rights, Indigenous issues, social enterprise, mental health, exercise physiology, journalism, and a few other things thrown in there. So a lot of my work draws on real-world experience in everyday lives of people and service delivery across a range of areas.
Well, I'm very happy to be able to discuss this with you. Could you tell us what is post-growth? What does post-growth mean?
What is post-growth? That's a great question. The first thing to say is we probably want to put the word economic in the middle. So we're talking really about post-economic growth. And then we want to add a word at the end as well, which is dependent, because we're talking really about post-economic growth dependent. What does that mean? Well, the reality is our current system is set up such that it has to grow in order to survive. And we can think about this most simply when we think about our economy at the moment. If you don't have an economy in our current setup that grows, you have recession. And if you have a couple of recessions in a row, then or a big enough recession, then you're looking at a depression. So just on that very surface level, our economy right now is one, this is largely globally the same, across different nations. We have a situation where if your economy doesn't grow in terms of GDP, gross domestic product, which the way I like to think of that is sort of like your national profit margin. In essence, it means, and there's a technical explanation for it that I won't go into, but it means essentially, are you producing more monetary value across the economy in terms of end products? Are you creating more stuff? Are you selling more stuff? These sorts of things. And so our current economy requires that we keep selling more stuff, growing the overall size of the economy. And that's actually pretty dangerous because we live on a finite planet. We have limits to resources. But there's actually another piece to it which doesn't get looked at too often, and that is whenever you have an economy that's growing, but you have the monetary gains from that economic growth accumulating with a small number of people, corporations, and sometimes governments, essentially when the rich are getting richer from this process, you have a dangerous situation that happens on the flip side, which is that the debt of individuals, of households, of corporations, and of governments has to increase. And that takes a little bit of explanation and unpacking. But for now, I'll just say one of the biggest problems with our growth-dependent economy is that it actually requires, our current economic setup requires that debt always expands. There has to be more and more debt in our system. And it's why households are going into more debt. It's why lots of small businesses are underwater in terms of the amount that they owe in loans. It's why our governments continue to expand their national debts, because it's an inbuilt phenomenon whenever you have a capitalistic system that concentrates money. And so a post-growth economy is an economy that is no longer dependent on that growth. What would it look like? What would it feel like to be in an economy that could fluctuate in size according to needs?
Yeah.
One that would be driven by the needs of individuals and the environment in a way where you can expand the money supply, you can expand the amount that you're producing in an economy if it's needed, and if it's not needed, it can contract. That to us is a sane economy, and a growth-dependent economy on a finite planet is an insane economy.
So actually, in an earlier episode of Wild Roots, I had a wonderful interview with Richard Heimberg, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And we talked about the importance of needing less and focusing on what truly is valuable to ourselves and to society. And right now, people are speaking about this booming economy. And environmentally speaking, a booming economy is actually quite disastrous for the environment.
It's disastrous for the environment, but the piece that I think that's even more compelling is that it's disastrous for the people in the economy. And when I say the people, I mean the vast majority of people. And this is the piece that has been essentially the cotton wool that's been pulled over our eyes in this process. This notion that economic growth is always associated with progress. And it's an easy thing it's very alluring and very easy to get sucked into this, because people will point to, well, look at what's happened in terms of material progress around the world. Look at material prosperity, and they'll particularly point to China and say, look at how many people have been pulled out of poverty, for example. Yet the question I often ask people as a follow-up to that is, what's happened in terms of the debt that individuals, corporations, and governments around the world, in places like China, for example, what has happened in terms of that debt? And that's the untold story, because the reality is you can make something look good right up until the point that it collapses. You can put a Band-Aid over things by allowing money to expand in an economy quickly by essentially dropping interest rates, for example, which is what happened right after the 2008 crash. Many of your listeners will remember that interest rates went to zero, essentially, as a way for governments around the world to try to kickstart their economies again. And what that did was it meant that there was a flood of lending back into a situation where people didn't want to lend because the trust had disappeared. But what that did was it increased the debt within our economy faster than ever. If you look at global debt and its trajectory, it went up faster than ever after 2008. So the environmental piece is crucial because we live on one planet and our planet is ultimately what sits underneath our formal economy. But there's also this other piece that doesn't get talked too much because of this veneer, this mirage of economic growth always equals greater prosperity that forgets that economic growth in a capitalist system where money concentrates means that there always has to be growing debt, and that's unsustainable.
Yeah.
That has a real impact on people's lives that gets hidden. And in the US, there's this really interesting thing because I feel like a lot of people are so bought into the system. I mean, we're all part of a capitalist system in one shape or form, whether or not we try to opt out and go off grid and be in nature as much as possible and share with our local community and barter and all of these kind of alternatives. The reality is at some point we're hooked into the system and we're participating in it. And
Yeah.
so it's almost this bind that we get caught in that, well, we therefore have to at least appreciate that there are some good aspects around the capitalist system. Now, that's where there's an interesting question there because really, is it the capitalist system that are giving us those benefits or is it a market economy?
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism is just one form of economic system that engages the market approach. But the reality is the capitalist system is also what's sitting underneath the growing inequality. A lot of the mental illness that we're seeing emerge through comes from a system where you have such a concentration of wealth. And so a
Yes.
lot of people I see still want to sort of bow to the system itself in deference to something while they're simultaneously experiencing its adverse effects. And there's a cognitive dissonance there. There's an inability to make the connection and say, oh, the reason why I can't pay my bills and I can't afford to rent my house anymore and I'm moving into my van is actually because it's inherent to the economic system. Instead, a lot of people will often take that on and say, well, obviously, I'm just not working hard enough, or there aren't enough jobs, or the housing market is too expensive, or these sorts of things. When in reality, all of those things come from the very underpinnings of the capitalist system itself.
Yeah. I think many of us, I believe, whether we're directly aware of it or not, depending on circumstances and such, would welcome a system other than the one we have today, especially if people could really wrap their heads around what that might look like. And I think that that clarity isn't always there on how to make that world system possible. And one thing I see is that we don't even live within our means. And what I mean by this is our non monetary means. We have a lot of other assets that we could be offering and applying to the whole system. And in terms of money, actually, many people live beyond their monetary means, mostly in debt, like you said. And it almost seems like an easier way of life for people and is considered normal and an acceptable way of living. So number one, we're not living within our full range of means as far as what our potential assets are beyond money. And number two, we consume too much, therefore we live in this excess all the time. So, which is the for-profit model of economics. It keeps us forever in need of something, and even if that means something that's harmful to us or the environment.
Right.
So a not-for-profit world that serves not only people but the planet is a model I can only imagine many people, including myself, have dreamed of. How can we make this not-for-profit, purpose-driven future a reality?
That's a great question. Obviously, one that we've been working on for many years now. And something struck us in talking with people about these ideas over the last 7 years. We realized that there was an easier way for people to understand our model based on their own lived experience and, in fact, their own innate experience. So For the last 7 years, we have been conducting an experiment around the world across all sorts of demographics that reminds us that we inherently know how to organize an economy that works for us all and for the planet. The experiment goes like this. We get people to have a piece of paper in front of them and divide that paper down the center to two halves. And then we ask them to write on the top left-hand side present, and then in the top right-hand side future. We then ask them to imagine a world in the future that's working for people and planet, for everyone. And when they've imagined that, we ask them then to feel it. What does it feel like? And once they've got that feeling, we ask them to draw on the paper, on that half of the paper, a symbol or shape that represents that feeling. We then get them to do the same on the left-hand side for the current economy. How does it feel?
Yeah.
Something amazing emerges. Everyone, well, 90% of people, over 90% of people draw one of three shapes or symbols for the future, and they draw one of three shapes or symbols for the present. They draw the same thing. For the future, they always draw either a circle, an infinity symbol, or a wave sign. And for the present, they always draw an isosceles triangle, a downward arrow, or a jagged line, like a stock market graph.
Oh, wow.
Now, this tells us a lot. Firstly, it tells us, and it might be obvious to listeners, the future that people imagine has fluidity. It's non-linear. It has what you might consider the feminine principle built in. And the present is very rigid, linear, and masculine. And what's fascinating is no one has ever drawn a curved shape for the present economy, ever.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Right. Now this, remember, is across demographics. That means that we can have hardcore conservatives, hardcore progressives, people of different religious belief, across genders, across age, across wealth. Across all of those differences, people consistently draw the same thing.
Wow.
What that tells us is we inherently know that for our economy to work, you have to have flow built in.
Yeah.
And we know that our current economy doesn't have flow inherently built in. And that gets back to this cognitive dissonance, right? Because most people would look at our economy, in my experience, they look at our economy and they say, oh, but there is flow. You know, there's market transactions, things are getting traded. Right. Then what is it that feels like there isn't any flow? And that's the reality of what I was sharing before around money and debt. The reality is the money doesn't flow in our economy in a way that the debt could be raised or dropped based on need. Instead, the money gets concentrated and the debt has to keep expanding elsewhere. And that's actually why we have a growth economy, because the people, governments, and businesses that are in debt need to go into more debt just to survive.
Right.
Because they don't have the money in order to pay down their debts.
Yeah, it's easier to remain in debt.
Well, it's not even so much that it's easier, it's that it mathematically is impossible not to do it any other way.
Yeah, it's a trap, and I think that you probably
trap.
have heard that multiple times from people, is that, well, we feel trapped. I mean, we
Right.
really literally feel trapped. How do we escape this? Yeah.
Let me even lay it on the line. If every single person in the world just worked harder and with an intention of living within their means, as the way you described it before, as in like reducing their debt, it would be mathematically impossible. It's not possible for the debt to get reduced because in order to reduce a debt, you need money. In order to get money, you have to have a system that is unlike capitalism where money circulates, because in capitalism, the reason that you invest money or start a business is primarily to make more money. And that's why the money concentrates. So coming back to this experiment and this notion of a different world, if you then say to yourself, okay, if we need an economy that has a principle of circulation built in naturally, where are there examples of that already existing in our current economy?
Which was my next question.
Right. Now, the first point to highlight here is that the community economy, the informal economy, the caring economy, the labor that's provided, for example, by parents, often mothers, to children, without any requirement for that to be repaid, is the greatest example of circulation inherent in our economy, right? There's just that natural reciprocity that occurs in communities. And it's not even reciprocity. It's often just a gift culture.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way. That's a beautiful way to vision it. Right. Yeah.
So it's on that basis that the formal market economy is able to function. But even within the formal market economy, our research has showed there's almost 20% of global GDP that comes from businesses that have no individual owners, and their profits circulate back into the organizations, the employees, their communities, according to their mission. And that form of business is what we describe as not-for-profit forms of business. And it includes 4 different types. The first one you'll be familiar with, which is consumer cooperatives. So if you have like an insurance company or a credit union, or a local cooperative grocery store, for example, or it could even be a childcare service. These are not-for-profit forms of business, as in they do business just like anyone else. Like you could look at Nationwide, the insurance company in the US, and go, right, they're a business. But if you check in then in terms of their legal structure and who owns the company, you discover that there's no individual owners. Just like there's no individual owners with Barcelona Football Club. The members are the owners, just like with any credit union around the world outside of Canada, which is an exception. There's no for-profit credit unions. They're all driven by purpose without any private individual owners of the assets. Then you have 3 other models. You have government enterprises where governments own businesses, and that's often in the local level. That's the government owning the water utility, for example, the electricity utility, or sports facilities, these sorts of things. And then all the way through to the national level, where you have governments that own and run postal services and the like, and often can turn a profit that is used to offset taxation. That's where the money goes back in then to reduce the need for taxation and increase the services that can be funded within a community or country, depending on the level of government. There are 2 other forms of not-for-profit business. There are foundation-owned businesses, so IKEA, for example, or Bosch, the engineering company, where a foundation actually owns the business. And these businesses are often ones that you just have no idea that there's a foundation that sits behind them, that all of the money goes over to the foundation. In the case of Bosch, it's about 93% actually. But that's a growing model. It's particularly strong in the Scandinavian countries, and it's one that's continuing to grow around the world at the moment. And then the 4th and final and probably most interesting model is what we call non-profit enterprise. So certainly 15 years ago, when I was working for non-profit organizations in Australia, my experience was, a non-profit, it's charity, it's supported by philanthropy of individuals or grants, etc. And that's the experience we have of other people's view of non-profits, is that they are charitable organizations, right, set up for a good cause, but reliant on the benevolence of others. Well, something amazing changed over the last 30 years around the world, and this is documented by Lester Salmon and his team at Johns Hopkins University, who looked at the data across 40 different countries, many of them some of the largest countries in the world. What they found was that non-profit organizations went into business. They started trading goods and services because they got tired of that dependency on philanthropy. And the data, and I'd have to check back in, it's been a little while since I looked at this, but from memory, only 12% of all nonprofits funding comes from philanthropic sources.
Very little.
The vast majority, 53%, comes from trading goods and services. And then there's another, I think it's around 20%, that comes from contracting to government, which in my opinion is the same thing as trading goods and services. It's just trading with a certain clientele. So that's fascinating to think that community groups, churches, I'm here at the moment doing this interview from Aberdeen, Scotland, where the church down the road here owns the cafe next door, owns and runs the cafe, and uses the profits from the cafe to subsidize the community work that the church does.
Wow, nice.
The gas station that is 500 yards down the road from where I am right now is cooperatively owned. The car that I drove in last night is with Co-Wheels Car Company, which is a shared vehicle program that is not for profit.
Wow.
There are these models of business that are emerging and are increasingly competitive in our capitalistic market. They're taking over market share that point the way to a different economy where businesses without individual owners are central, and we therefore move beyond capitalism. We move from a system that is growth dependent, where it's all about accumulating more and more and more, to a system where our model of business is about serving and in the process providing a livelihood for employees, families, etc.
So this kind of system works. And I think going back to how people are feeling trapped, I think a lot of people feel that their self-worth is a direct reflection of how much monetary value they have. And I think people really strive to want to do something meaningful, and myself included. And yet we feel like these meaningful jobs aren't valued that much, which I kind of feel naturally fall into this system that we're talking about here.
Right. That's totally understandable, those fears. The flip side of that is that with not-for-profit forms of business increasing their presence in the global market, you've got more opportunities now to look for a life that's driven by purpose and be expecting a decent salary in the process. In fact, in the US, if you compare not-for-profit and for-profit jobs, non-profits actually pay slightly higher on average than the for-profit sector. So that's an interesting thing that sort of busts a lot of myths that people have. Yes, there are a lot of non-profit jobs that if you were to do the equivalent in the for-profit world, you would earn a lot more. So there are people who make that sacrifice and say, I want that trade-off of having a purpose-driven reason for going to work. But there's also a lot more, I would say, pressure and incentive within not-for-profit forms of business to have a living wage, to have something that ensures that you're not just saying, hey, we're all about service, but we're forgetting the important needs of serving our employees, for example. So I think that is changing, but also remember we're in a system where the money concentrates and the debt is elsewhere, and so it's going to take time to reverse that, and probably a serious economic crash for that to really change. And so it is difficult. It is hard to find that balance of how do I survive and live a life that's meaningful simultaneously. There are trade-offs involved with that often.
Yeah, and I've experienced those trade-offs because I have worked for nonprofit as a field biologist and restorationist, and they do pay significantly better, but the work isn't always consistent, for instance, So there is that. But you do have a forthcoming book titled Hell on Earth. Could you tell us a little bit about that book? I kind of was hoping it was out already, and then I realized it wasn't. I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, that's a book that's been in the works for a long time with my co-author Jen Hinton in Sweden, and in reality, it isn't out largely because of of my procrastination. So hoping that'll be out in the next year. But essentially, it outlines, it extends on the kinds of things we've been discussing here. It repaints this idea of not-for-profit as something much different to our sense of non-profit. And it talks about how circulatory economics is actually within our grasp, building on what we already have, building on things that already work in our economy that are proven and extending those rather than the standard approach to an alternative or a utopian perspective, which is what kind of world do we want and how do we work backwards, which usually comes down to conversations around government regulation, which, as we know in the US, is pretty much a non-starter with half of the population. So we're interested in, and we explore in the book, where are the leverage points to help accelerate existing trends. So, for example, perhaps your listeners have heard of the Move Your Money campaign that was particularly big in the US about 10 years ago. And that was where people moved their money from the big for-profit banks over to credit unions. It was started by Kristen Christian, who a woman in California who just got fed up with Wells Fargo and the fees she was getting. And so she moved her money over and told her friends on Facebook she was doing that. And the reports are that I think somewhere between $4 and $6 billion of money got moved as a result of that campaign building. And so here's an interesting thing about that. You might be listening to this and saying, right, but I'm largely in debt and I've only got $150 in the bank and I live on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis in terms of survival. Why would my moving my money mean much? Well, the reality is if you move $150 or $150,000, both of those sums are more than you might realize because of what's called a fractional reserve banking. Because banks can lend out more than they actually have in reserves, when you move your money over, you're not just moving $150, let's say, you're moving the capacity for a whole lot more than that to be lent. So taking a stand and doing things like moving your money into a credit union or shifting, if you've got any money in assets, shifting them over to debt mechanisms rather than equity. So taking your money out of stocks and moving them into bonds, or even ideally exiting the whole system entirely and putting your money into funds that can support not-for-profit businesses, like in the US, the RSF Social Finance Fund. These sorts of things, and some of them are beyond people. I'm not, for example, don't have the disposable income to be investing in those sorts of things at the moment. I did a few years back put a small amount of money into one of those kind of funds, and yeah, I only got 0.75% return, which is less than inflation. But I knew that my money was helping other not-for-profit businesses to grow. And so there are these really powerful things that the more people, like how many people would ever think, oh, I could invest in not-for-profit businesses? I mean, it's you've got to get to stage one, which is there are not-for-profit businesses, right? Okay, and now I can invest in them. Wow, like so, all of these steps are what we outline in the book is as opportunities for us to really accelerate something that has been hidden right in plain sight.
So, do you have any encouraging last words of advice for people wanting to move towards this purpose-driven future of economics?
If you're looking to contribute to a future that's driven by purpose, an alternative beyond capitalism, what we call a full circle economy where there's an inherent circulation built into the system, where we're looking out for each other, where we're caring for each other, then I think the best things you can do on a practical way are to move your money, check out our work at the Post-Growth Institute, consider working for a not-for-profit organization and approaching them and asking them what their business model is and really encouraging them to move further into that space of competing in the marketplace in order to transition us beyond a competitive marketplace. The irony of that is not lost on me, but those sorts of actions, I think, there's a whole lot to become aware of when you just type in not-for-profit business into Google. You're going to find that there's a whole world that's emerging that has been largely hidden and not talked about. And I think it's so exciting to see what doors open up when you just see things through a different lens. When you can think beyond profit maximization, it really addresses, it comes all the way back to that greatest yearning inside our hearts for something that is circulatory, for a system where the love continuously goes around, where we're caring for each other and connected with each other in a way where we're putting that purpose and service first, and our business models reflect that, rather than the other way around, where our business models drive us to behave in ways that are counter to what our hearts are yearning.
Beautiful words of advice. Thank you. So on to my standard question. So Wild Roots is about connecting people back to nature, back to what's really important, appreciating the environment in which we all thrive, and being able to look out for that environment and care for it, and tries to encourage that whole spectrum, which encompasses a lot. Mm-hmm. So my question is, could you share with us today a special experience or connection that you have made in nature or with an animal, whether recent or as a child?
Absolutely. It happened last night.
Cool.
I'm here in Aberdeen, Scotland, and a gentleman who is an environmental scientist gave a talk last week at his institute, and he invited me to come and to a space which is set up for birding, which I'd never done before. So we went down to a town, I think it's called Stonehaven, just south of Aberdeen, to these cliffs, which, first of all, we drove into an area that Scotland's amazing in the sense that it has legislation now which is called right to roam, which means that anyone can be in nature and can set up a tent wherever they want, including on private land. There's no restriction.
Wow.
It's incredible. You can go over someone's fence, and if you want to, you can walk through that land. There's no trespassing. And in fact, all of the national parks here, they're largely privately owned, and the private owners, these families, just give access to people for all of them. So we are on this land that I don't know who owns it or if it's in custodianship, but there's immediately, as I arrived there, this sense of calm. Like the land is welcoming us to be there with it. And, these rolling hills and this beautiful lush green with so much rain here that rolls down onto the edge of these cliffs that then drop down into the ocean to the east of Scotland. And so we arrive at these cliffs, and the first thing you hear after the breeze through the grass is the birds squawking. And sure enough, as we go through this track, and these tracks aren't fully trodden tracks, they're ones where you're walking through the grass and you can just see the trail in front of you. So we're walking through, and then we're getting closer to the cliff edge as we move along. And unlike other places I've been as well, there's no guardrail or anything. It's just all of a sudden you come up and there's the cliff edge a couple of feet in front of you. And you peer over the cliff edge and you see, I want to say, millions of birds. And I suspect it is in the millions. There are these 100-yard high cliffs blackened by... the algae, the lichen, and all of these different birds across different species. Luckily, the gentleman with me knew the different names, and so he was telling me, and they're all coexisting on these cliff edges where they've just carved out little spots for them to nest and to have their chicks and all of these incredible processes. So you've got maybe 10,000 birds on the edges of these cliffs, and then 990,000 other birds swarming, swooping all the way out to maybe 2 miles out into the distance, on the water, dropped into the water, flying around. And just, I've never seen so many birds in my life. And it just really brought me into my heart, gave me hope, and to just see this, what appeared to be in a town that is known for its oil and gas. There was this part of the world that was just so untouched, so vibrant, so alive, and so life-giving. That was really touching.
What an incredible experience. Thank you for sharing. Several studies show that people who work in cooperative business models lead happier and more fulfilled lives. As Donnie points out, we inherently know that for our economy to work, there has to be fluidity. Just as a mother and child have an innate system of natural reciprocity, this inherent circulation is one we all know works best. This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.